Despite the leaps and bounds of popularity that anime has made in the past decade or so, it's still looked at as a niche interest, relegated to hobbyists and dedicated but lightly pocketed fans. And that is mainly because people tend to group visual media together if they're unfamiliar with it. Because films and American television shows are so predominant in our culture, we are able to compartmentalize the many kinds of films and shows available. For an example, we do not associate a sitcom with a courtroom drama because we know they're not the same, even though they share the fact that they are both television shows. However, as interests remove themselves from the generally accepted mainstream, the harder it is to distinguish individual works from each other. We talked about this before in regards to comic books as well as anime, about how saying that you are a fan of either one of them seemingly means you are a fan of it as a whole, instead of the more likely scenario that you are a fan of a number of titles that just happen to be comic books or anime. This broad generalization stems from the fact that it's just simpler to think that way, especially for someone with no inclination or desire to learn about it. Inadvertently, this thought process led to a number of instances where hentai was labeled and shelved in the kids section of video rental stores. Because it's a cartoon, and why wouldn't it be for kids? This was so prevalent, by the way, that hentai DVDs had to print warning labels on the covers to stop this from happening, even when they are clearly porn. It's difficult for anime to be given a singular identity when it's just like any other form of entertainment. It has no singular identity. It's a multifaceted entity that is capable of giving us a broad spectrum of stories, and in some cases, the only means by which a story can be told, which is certainly the case for the place promised in our early days. Directed by Makoto Shinkai, a renowned animator who went on to direct 5 centimeters per second and Children Who Chase Lost Voices, The Place Promised is his first feature film. Much like how Jinro could only be told as an anime, so too does The Place Promised in our early days share a similar fate, not only because of its setting, but because of its story. It's a sci-fi coming-of-age yarn set against an alternate history where Japan has been split between the southern United States and the northern Soviet Union, not unlike Korea or Vietnam. Surely, with such a politically complicated setup, the plot can get lost in its own premise. And sadly, that's exactly what happens. This is the place promised in our early days. We begin our story with our main character, Hiroki, reminiscing about, well, the entire movie.
It was before the war, when the huge island called Azo was still a foreign territory.
Looking back, it was the best summer of my life. They were my best friends.
Alright, no real criticism here, but I've always disliked this narrative mechanic as far as storytelling is concerned, because I've never seen it used where it didn't come off as contrived. Usually when this occurs, it's because a character sees something that reminds him of something from his past, and then proceeds to reminisce with the audience about it. Done well, it's merely a formality for the coming story, but when not, it's just hokey. The best this can hope to be is just transparent exposition. And like I said, it's not a deal breaker or anything, but god damn it is it a pet peeve of mine. Regardless of how clumsily the story began, it looks like it's recovering nicely. We have Hiroki and his friend Takia enjoy their last few days before their school break, and it seems that Hiroki has a little crush on one of his classmates, Sayuri. It's actually kind of cute seeing Hiroki stumble around Sayuri, not knowing how to compose himself at that age. Let it be known that no matter what I have to say about this film as a whole, I still appreciate it for giving me a chance to talk about something other than, what is this? I don't even! But then, the frustration starts to mount.
At the 11th ministerial level conference between America and the Union, scheduled for 3 days from the 12th, it appears that the focus will be Japan's response to the North-South problem continuing to cause tension. The Union government shows their deep concerns about the reinforcement of Misawa Base and the other American facilities. On the other hand, the American government shows their uneasiness toward the fact that the Union
Hello.
has not been yet made
Cool, I'm just in time for a tea break.
No, please, interrupt this world-building exposition about the now divided Japan that can only help the audience better understand this world that we're trying to emotionally invest in over tea. I sense that this was an intentional choice, juxtaposing the troubled times with the kids' naivete or youthful ignorance, as this is not the only time when the real world is held to the background to these kids' stories. But the problem is that by the time the real world does come crashing in and forces the kids to deal with it, we know very little about this conflict. In fact, the only reason why I was able to tell you that it's basically a Vietnam situation is because I read several plot synopses. We never find out why there was a Japanese divide, nor is the Soviet Union actually named. They just keep calling them the Union to further muddy the narrative. This is actually a very Japanese thing to do in fiction, as the cultural idea of war was that the enemy is the enemy, and there is no need to delineate their identity further than that. Examples of othering the enemy in such a way can be found in titles like Grave of the Fireflies, where the Allies were not brought up once. They were just called the enemy. But in The Place Promised, they specified that the Southern Territory belongs to the United States, and not to an entity using non-specific nomenclature like the Allies. Paired up with the United States, the Union sounds entirely fictitious because there's no real specific example to contrast the US to, unlike the term Soviet. And even that wouldn't be so bad if it weren't for the fact that the entire climax of the story hinges on this conflict. But we'll get to that. In the meantime, the film is laying out its story at a more methodical pace than what we've been made used to, as it seems that Hiroki and Takia are spending their time either working at this man's machine shop, salvaging parts for the military, or fixing up a downed rocket that they came across one day in hopes of turning it into a plane and flying it to a mysterious tower that looms over them on an island in the north.
You want to go with us, Sayuri?
What? Is it okay? Really? Yes, I'll go! I wanna go! Wow! Thank you.
But I don't know if it'll be able to fly.
Don't worry. It'll fly.
Yeah. Okay, then it's a promise.
This is actually one of my favorite scenes in the film, and that's mainly because of something that can easily go unnoticed. In the background of the scene is the tower in question, but it's surrounded by thundering, ominous storm clouds, a bit of foreshadowing to parallel the optimism found between the three kids. It's a nice, subtle touch. That is, until the narration comes in and kicks whatever sense of subtlety they had out the window.
I think there was nothing for us to fear at that moment. But the truth was that the world and history were changing all around us.
Why even bother with the visual foreshadowing if you're just going to verbally explain to the audience what you're foreshadowing? Jesus. Still, it has to be said that the best part of the movie is how it portrays the relationship between Hiroki, Takia, and Sayuri. It's downright endearing seeing the three interact with each other and see how their friendship blossoms. And you can start to picture in your head the kind of story this is shaping up to be because of how it's setting itself up. A coming-of-age fantasy where kids are forced to grow up and learn about themselves in the face of political strife and conflict. An anime October sky, if you will. And that's sort of where the plot goes? Kind of? Sayuri suddenly sees a vision of the tower being destroyed, and this sets off the actual plot. We immediately cut to 3 years later, and Takia now works for a government laboratory studying the effects of the tower in the north, and the existence of parallel worlds, and Hiroki is left wondering about Sayuri, who he hasn't seen in all the time that has passed. Okay, can't say I was expecting this. I don't think even Sele could have expected this, but I could groove to this sudden and jarring shift.
We both do research dealing with parallel worlds.
Parallel worlds?
Well, just like a person dreams at night, the universe also dreams. My research is to investigate the effects that the parallel worlds have on people's brains and dreams.
I think? While Takia has moved on from building the plane and Hiroki has since turned to being a mopey high schooler for the last 3 years, Sayuri suffers a more fairy tale fate. Stricken by an acute and bizarre form of narcolepsy, she has more or less been dreaming for the last 3 years. Stuck in a prison of her own mind, Hiroki's laboratory has caught wind of it, and they make the connection that her condition is linked to the tower, somehow.
The operation level of the tower has suddenly been raised. The limits of the disparate matter conversion are expanding rapidly.
Conscious activity level of the subject is increasing at the same time. She may be waking up. Professor, could this be...
Disparate matter conversion has exceeded 20 kilometers.
Is this going to overwrite the world?
Okay, now we just crossed the threshold of believability. What? That's right, the tower that was built by the Soviets is connected to Sayuri, and should she wake up from her deep sleep, the tower will displace the entire world, effectively destroying it. There are certainly many questions surrounding such a turn, but chief among them has to be... why? Why is the tower connected to Sayuri?
Why does it have to be Sayuri?
Although there are more matters that we don't know than matters that we do, I doubt this is purely coincidence. Eskin Skone, the designer of the tower, is her grandfather.
Why would her grandfather do that? Did he lose an office pool bet? Why would anyone so thoroughly imperil their loved ones and the world in such a way? Unless... They hated both. Okay, jokes aside, all this plot point does is cast an overwrought and maudlin haze over the story. Once the time shift happens, all life is just sucked out of the film. What was once endearing and wistful is replaced with repeated, dreary monologues about how Hiroki misses Sayuri, and how Sayuri misses Hiroki, and how in her dreams she sees the plane, and following it leads her to Hiroki, and my patience is just stretched to the breaking point. What was so wrong with a story about a couple of kids wanting to build a plane that they had to introduce this unneeded pseudoscience into the plot? And that's when the story is focusing on those two. When it shifts gears to focus on Takia, it's even worse. Apparently, Takia has family on the Union side, and so does his old boss of the machine shop, so they decide to act as guerrilla fighters to help provoke a full-scale war to reunite Japan. See what I mean about this war just being this huge encumbrance on the story? We're supposed to be invested in what Takia is doing, but when we know so little about the politics of the region, especially since now we know that this is taking place in an alternate history, where real-world history might as well be thrown out the window, how can we? It's even worse when you notice that the very few times the conflict takes center stage, it barely has enough time to register as something that's even happening. Takia and his boss try to escape a patrol boat during an operation and get shot down, only for the scene to cut to Hiroki dreaming about Sayuri, and when we finally cut back to Takia, who had taken shrapnel to his shoulder, he's fine and in bed without any explanation of how they escaped from that patrol ship. Well, fuck you too, movie! The entire premise of this anime, the tower, the friendship between these three characters, the fucking setting, all hinges on this conflict. We should be able to say more about it than the contents of the Pulp Fiction briefcase. The film drags itself to a climax as Hiroki finally confronts Takia and they catch themselves up with what's been going on. Hiroki wants to fulfill his promise to Sayuri by flying her to the tower, thinking that it will wake her up, but Takia refuses the idea, knowing that it will end the world, and the scene ends on bad terms. Except not. Psych your mind, I guess, as Takia abducts Sayuri's sleeping body and both him and Hiroki now plan on flying to the tower as both the northern and southern armies march to war to destroy the tower. So, what was the point of this melodrama again? This could be so much better than it is. To be fair, the final scene of Hiroki piloting the plane through the battle as they reach the tower is spectacularly animated and shot. In fact, the whole film looks wonderful, as it plays with tones of yellow and orange to affect the mood of the film. But as it draws to a close, as the tower is destroyed and Sayuri wakes up, the only thing I feel is a sense of disappointment. I think I made my point about how this film feels like a completely different story from how it began, and I don't want to belabor anything, but I really wish it didn't. There was so much potential here that to see it go the way it did feels absolutely frustrating. We didn't need to spend half of the film following Hiroki bleakly musing about dreams and loneliness, and we certainly didn't need to pin the world ending on Sayuri waking up. I suppose if I had to sum up my feelings on the film, it's that while I can appreciate the technical quality and certain story beats and moments, there were too many decisions I didn't agree with, and the lack of story cohesion keeps me from giving it a stronger endorsement than that. Admirable, but flawed. In my line of work, there are way worse things you can be. Just ask Mai. Till next time.